What is up, guys? In today's video, I'm going to be going over several tips to hopefully help you stop losing to third parties in Fortnite Zero Build or outplay them when the time does come. As always, if you guys do enjoy this video, find it helpful, informative, or interesting, remember to give it a like, subscribe if you like some more. Let me know down in the comments below if you get tilted losing to third parties in Fortnite, and if you guys would like to use my code in the item shop. It is EvolveJake, and it is underneath the webcam at all times. So third parties have been a constant problem for players to deal with in, Fortnite, but pretty much just every BR. When you boil a Battle Royale down, it's just a large free-for-all. And when that's the case, players are going to be looking to take advantage of other players, fighting and being low on resources, or just, not being entirely paying attention to threats in that moment. And so this will be a common problem that you deal with throughout all of your, experience playing Battle Royales. I think the biggest thing you can do to limit how often you lose to third parties, or make it not as much of a problem, is just how you approach the game limits how much of a problem it's going to be, because you're always going to get third partied. It's going to be something you have to deal with, but you can limit how much it impacts you. I think a lot of players make themselves very susceptible to third parties because they're way too tunnel visioned on the opponent they're fighting. And then they also take too much damage while fighting an enemy. And that's like the biggest thing you can do to help you deal with third parties, I think, is just recognize that it's going to be a problem before it happens. It needs to be something that you're always thinking about and always having in the back of your mind, because, as I said, it's going to come up constantly throughout the game. And if you're way too tunnel visioned on just the one opponent you're fighting at all times, you're letting your guard down and you're not paying as much attention to other things, or not thinking as clearly about other things. And that's going to put you at risk of getting third partied. So when you are fighting enemy players, still try to keep your wits about you as far as your surrounding and what else is going on in the game. And as I said, recognizing that it could be a problem before it happens is a very big one, because there's lots of times in game where there's several people in the area. And that might be a time where you want to just proactively reposition or let an enemy go. That's a big one that a lot of people struggle with. I think just playing a lot and kind of being aware of the pacing of the game can help a lot with this. But also something like visual audio and the sound effects settings can really help you be more aware of how many players are in an area, or if there are other people in the area that you weren't necessarily aware of. Sound also helps, but visual audio is really OP. Taking too much damage in fights is something that's going to obviously leave you more vulnerable for, the third parties that are impending. And this is something that I stress a lot when making the spectating videos, or many other videos I make, is that a lot of people will just jump on enemies. They'll be full HP and the enemy will be full HP, and they'll just kind of jump on them and then trade damage with the enemy. And maybe they get the elimination that way. Maybe they get several eliminations that way. But if you're not getting opening tags to start a fight, or playing off of cover well, or playing fights, somewhat safe, if every fight you get into is just you and an opponent standing out in the open trading damage, it can work, but you're making yourself vulnerable for third parties. And the more you're making yourself vulnerable for third parties, the more often you're doing that, the more likely it does eventually, bite you and cost you the game. This is something that happens a lot with the mist gloves this season. A lot of people, it kills really fast in close range, but it's not a particularly safe playstyle. And so you can get kills doing that, and you can definitely win doing that. But as I said, you're increasing your chances of getting third party doing this way. So if you find yourself being someone that is constantly, super weak after fights, you probably need to try to play a bit safer, or play a bit more structured in your fights. As I said, getting opening tags, pushing in, getting the kill quickly, and not taking as much damage. And that's something that's rough. Some people don't relate it because it's not exactly what gets you third partied, but it sets you up to get punished by the third party. Another thing that can really set you up to get punished by third parties is spending too much time looting after fights. This is something that, a lot of people, obviously, they're really concerned about loot. And I see this in comment sections on my videos, or comment sections on my stream as well, where people will be like, oh my god, you missed this higher rarity AR. How could you do that? And it's I'm more concerned about just, as soon as I get an elimination, I'm more concerned about impending third parties than I just necessarily am looting. If I have a blue AR and there's a purple one there, sure, I would want that purple one, but I would rather have my blue AR and be able to deal with a fight that's about to happen than be looking at the ground when an enemy jumps on me. So I think you need to not pay as much attention to loot. This doesn't mean you can't loot at all, but your safety and the potential third parties, I think, should always be a higher priority than what loot is on the ground, especially if you have decent loot. Throughout the game, you know, there will be times where you know you need certain things. Maybe you have no heals, you need heals. Maybe you have no mobility, you need mobility. Maybe you have a terrible shotgun, you need a better shotgun. But if you kind of already know what you're looking for in a loot pile, that will make it much easier for you to loot the enemy. If you're great on heals, if your AR is high rarity, and really the only thing you need is a shotgun, then you don't really need to pay as much attention to like what heals they had or what AR they had. You don't need to think about like item by item, do I want to swap for this? You should kind of already know what you need to improve your current setup. And as I said, even if your loot isn't the greatest, would you rather have good loot? Would you rather get an upgrade to your loot that you just immediately lose because you die to a third party? Would you rather survive with that slightly worse loot? A lot of times I would rather I would rather have the slightly worse loot, but be in better positioning and have better timing for fights. And this kind of goes hand in hand with not repositioning after fights. A lot of players, they get into a fight and everybody in the area knows that a fight just happened there. Even if you aren't aware that there's people there, there's definitely a potential chance that there's enemies in the area. So a lot of times after a fight, I'm immediately kind of looking around and trying to see if I see any enemies pushing me. But also I want to reposition after that fight as fast as possible to some piece of cover, especially if I need to heal. If you need to heal and you're in a somewhat safe area, okay, then maybe it's better than repositioning. But if you're in a bad area, just healing out in the open is much worse than kind of using a base boost glove use or two, going to cover, healing, and then maybe coming back for that loot after you've healed. Just repositioning after a fight is something that can nip a lot of third parties in the bud. Being in hot areas on the map is also something that will definitely get you third partied. A lot of times this will happen around like the objectives. If if you're going for island, there's probably third parties in that area. If you're going for a medallion, there's probably other people in that area going for third parties, or just, there's other people in the area going for the medallion. But also there's just certain areas on the map that are not naturally more hot than others. Like the gas station that's kind of in the center of the map currently is an area that is typically pretty hot. So if you're in this area, just know that you need to keep your awareness even higher if you're in one of these hot areas or fighting for one of these objectives, because this draws other people to the area, which is often going to lead to you getting third partied. Another thing that's going to increase your odds of this a lot is when you get into those smaller zones. For example, if it's a 1v1v1 endgame and you're fighting, that other player is almost always going to third party you. But same thing goes if you're like in an endgame and it's not the smallest circle, but there's still a good amount of people left alive relative to the size of the circle. Those are times where you're pretty much always just going to get hopped on as soon as you fight. And so I would be even more inclined to like immediately reposition after a fight, or, ignore the loot, etc. Just like certain times it's going to be more of a problem and you need to be more adamant about like avoiding putting yourself at risk in those moments. Another thing that will really go hand in hand with third parties is when you're taking too long to end fights, because a lot of times, and it's like a weird middle ground, because earlier I said you want to play a bit safer and not take as much damage, but also you don't want to play too safe and just let the fight go on for longer and longer, because then your chances of getting third partied are even higher. So if you're playing too safe, it's not great. If you're playing too risky, it's also not great. You need to find a middle ground, because the longer you're fighting, the more likely you get third partied. Also, just being in fights that are kind of going nowhere, I think is something that costs a lot of people their game, because they're too focused on the thing they're fighting. Like, let's take this season, for example. The Spire AR is solid at range, but if you have an enemy like 150 meters away, is it really worth tap firing them with the Spire AR? I'll do it sometimes for sure, because I like getting those eliminations, but it's oftentimes a risk that's not worth it, because it's going to take a while for you to get that elimination just tap firing at that range. But it's also one of those things where the enemy has an easy out because you're so far away. And when you're too fixated on these very long range fights, you're making yourself more vulnerable to anybody that might be like close by you getting an easy shot on you. So knowing kind of when a fight is not worth fighting because it's so far away, and just not partaking in that, will definitely decrease your chances of getting third partied. And I think over chasing as well is part of this as well. And I'm definitely very guilty of this. If I get damage on somebody and they're running, I definitely want to like chase them and get that elimination. But over chasing not only makes you vulnerable to the person you're chasing maybe turning the fight on you. But third parties are also, you know, gonna have an easier time dealing with you because you're using your mobility to chase that person, so it's gonna be on cooldown potentially if the fight does end. But also, if you're over chasing, you're probably too tunnel visioned on that player as well. So just being willing to let certain players escape and just not over chase is something that can also really help you survive getting third partied or limit the chances you get third partied. And so that was a lot about just how to limit getting third partied, because I think that is the biggest thing you can do to reduce how many games you lose to third parties, is just making it not as much of a problem as it would be otherwise. And this is something that I think a lot of players kind of struggle to relate to when it comes to like watching streams or watching videos, because if you watch a player that plays well and just kind of naturally does this, you might watch and be like, wow, this person is not getting third partied as much as me. Like, why is that? And it's because they're consistently like putting themselves in the right spot, backing off when they need to, letting people go when they need to, ending fights quickly, not playing as risky and taking too much damage. When you do all of that well, the game is going to look much easier than if you're making those critical mistakes and then just getting chain third partied. So doing all of that well, I think makes your game just much easier. When it comes to dealing with third parties, because even if you do everything perfectly, it's going to happen sometimes. It's the nature of the game. As I said, the biggest thing you can do is reposition after fights, look around after fighting, be aware of your surroundings. But if you are going to get third partied, the two most essential things for Zero Build are going to be mobility items and cover items. You always want to be carrying some form of mobility in Zero Build, I think, or a cover item, or both, just depending on the game and the situation. Mobility, I think, is often going to be your best chance of survival, especially if you're able to like proactively reposition after a fight before the third party is even a problem. That is a big one. But just assuming you are getting third partied, just full on running often won't work, because then you're really not defending yourself to the enemy. If you are trying to escape a third party, they already have pressure on you, right? Because they're pushing into you. You're maybe weak. You're maybe not ready to fight. You need to get that pressure off somehow. And a lot of times what this will be is just using your mobility to get to some sort of cover, and then looking back to get damage on them as they chase you. Because a lot of times people over chase, and if they're pushing you and you're already at some sort of cover, you should be able to like right shoulder peek, hopefully get some shots on them. And then from this, you could maybe push and get the elimination if you feel comfortable fighting at that point in time. Or you can use the fact that you beamed them and they probably want to heal yourself and then reset that fight. It really depends on the situation. If you're quite healthy and you think you're healthier than them now that you got those shots on them, you can maybe push that. But if you're really weak, then you probably just want to heal, and just using the damage you got on that enemy to alleviate the pressure and buy yourself a chance to heal is something that's big. That's one mistake I see a lot of players make, is when they're running, they're just trying to run and not fight. But if you just full run all the time, sometimes people will let you go, but oftentimes you're not defending yourself doing that. And an opponent that's over chasing you is somebody who's very vulnerable to just getting tagged, because if you're the one running, you kind of decide when you're going to turn back and shoot, and they're not necessarily very prepared for that. So if you're trying to reset a fight, you want to get to some sort of cover and then just look back and get shots on the enemy. And then the same is kind of true with cover items, but it really depends. If you have a shield bubble, you can throw it down, and then now people can't shoot at you from long range. Maybe now they need to push you, and you get that same sort of scenario where you can just peek from the bubble and beam them, get some of that pressure off of you, or, reset the fight or get the kill, just depending on what you want to do. But if someone's like in your face and you're weak after fighting, the cover items don't work as well. And sometimes the mobility items won't work as well. It really depends on the situation. But I think in Zero Build, you 100% want to be carrying some form of mobility and some sort of cover item. Not only just for dealing with third parties, but it's like one of the only things you can do to deal with third parties in Zero Build. But that is kind of basically going to be it for this video. When it comes to getting third partied, you don't have the most options. The best thing you can do is kind of limit how much it's going to happen to you, or limit how much of a problem it's going to be when it does happen to you, as I kind of talked about. And if it is happening, you probably just need to try to find a way to get to cover, get damage back on them to get that pressure off of you. But this is going to be something that always happens in Fortnite or any BR. So there's nothing you can really do to just never lose to third parties again, but putting yourself in the best situation to deal with it when it does happen, is going to result in you losing a lot less games to it, and then hopefully going on to win more matches. But that is going to be it for this video. As always, if you guys did find this to be helpful, informative, or interesting, remember to give it a like, subscribe if you'd like to see more, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks for watching.